So from all the musical styles that we've talked about up until this point, very few have had the worldwide reach and influence that rap and hip-hop have. Um, Maybe coming close would be heavy metal and hard rock. I've seen heavy metal and hard rock in places as far-flung as China, in Brazil, things like that. Um, but there's so many other styles that we've talked about that didn't have that sort of influence. Surf rock, not so much. Even psychedelic rock seems to have really kind of disappeared in a lot of ways. But hip-hop, now going on 30 years in and of itself as a style, continues to evolve and continues to thrive throughout the world. So what I'd like to do now is to examine some of the beginnings of hip-hop, some of the first examples that we can find of hip-hop, and rap in particular. So really we can trace a huge amount of rap back to Jamaica. And thinking about, as some of you might recall, the notion of the mobile sound systems, those trucks that pulled up that had enormous sound systems that would arrive at a party and start playing music. Well, typical of this situation was what they would call the sound selector. So this would be the guy who was actually playing the records, who was deciding what was going to go next, and would sequence songs in an order. And then also there would be the DJ. Now, the DJ in this case would be the person who is actually going to rap, who is going to talk over everything. The guy who is in control of the microphone. And they were known for what was called toasting. Toasting basically meant doing a kind of rhythmic sort of rap over whatever the sound selector was playing. And these toasts generally consisted of boasting, saying why this particular DJ was going to be the biggest hit, how he was the best there is, and had all of the great skills. This idea of DJs toasting over records finds its way to one of the largest immigrant communities from Jamaica, from Puerto Rico, from the Caribbean, and that's in New York. New York has these enormous neighborhoods that are so infused with a lot of immigrant culture. So these sound selectors and DJs and toasting ends up finding its way into New York, into basically these kind of private parties, these block parties that would occur. And that's how it moves up there. And we can think about some real key figures like I had mentioned, like Kool Herc, for example, and also the Sugar Hill Gang, which we'll talk about shortly. So they bring this practice up to New York. And one of the things that I want to point out, what I think is unique about rap and hip-hop, is the way in which it almost inverts the band structure that we've talked about up until this point. If you think about all of the bands we've talked about, it kind of functions in this kind of pyramid-like hierarchy, where at the top you have your vocalist, your singer. That's the person that everybody's going to focus on. Maybe below them we have one of the key instrumentalists. So we talked about in heavy metal how the guitarist was going to be the key instrumentalist, the person who represented the musicality and the virtuosity of the group. We can think about in other cases, like for instance, if we go all the way back to Chicago blues, well, maybe in that case it might have been the harmonica player who had a key role within the music. So this all kind of varies, but then beneath that, now we start to get the rhythm section, right? The drums, how the drums define so much of the music rhythmically. But at the same time, the drummer is very rarely the person who is known out front, who's talked about, who's idolized, who has a sense of leadership with the band. Very rarely does that occur. And usually, and this is going to sound bad in case any of you are bass players, but usually at the bottom is the bass player. He's at the bottom of the totem pole. He's the other guy who's playing the guitar-like instrument, but he never really does much, that kind of thing. And if you think about it, the bass has always had this supportive role, except in the case of, let's say, funk that we've talked about, but most often supportive. So you have a lead singer and then everybody else kind of falls underneath. Well, I'm going to kind of say that that's reversed in terms of hip hop because we have multiple people who basically function as the vocalists. And then underneath them is only one instrumentalist, the DJ. And so I kind of find rap and hip hop to be interesting because it reverses this whole sort of structure. There is not necessarily a leader in terms of this is the person you are always going to focus on. So, in addition to rap as a musical style, it accompanies a broader pattern of hip-hop culture. And we can include in this things like clothing. A lot of different clothing styles emerge throughout hip-hop's history, but it's directly tied to this idea of hip-hop culture. So whether we're talking about the big gold chains and the Adidas of the mid-1980s, whether we're talking about the parachute pants and the real bright, vibrant, Afrocentric colors of the late 80s and early 90s. That's another thing yet again. Hip-hop style changes, but we always see how it's associated as this kind of bigger cultural practice, embracing the music, embracing clothing, embracing dance, breakdancing, popping and locking, all of the different styles that have accompanied rap and different kind of rap subgenres. Well, that's another enormous part of it as well. So we have all these different elements that go into rap, go into hip-hop culture, and it really kind of follows it in its evolution and development. Now, one kind of interesting thing worth considering is the difficulty that rap as a musical style had in terms of breaking into an American media market. In a lot of cases, early rap and early hip-hop was essentially ignored by radio stations. It was ignored by the major TV shows, the music-oriented TV shows, whether they were black or white-oriented. They were ignored. Rap artists were ignored as a whole. In a lot of ways, I would make the argument that rap really does start off as this underground practice, as something that was happening within parties, that was happening within these neighborhoods, but never really exploded onto a national scene throughout the early 1970s, and really, in a lot of ways, in the early 1980s. So rejected by radio markets, rejected by TV markets, rejected by white markets, rejected by black markets.